Welcome everybody, Alyssa and Michelle. Maybe we'll wait a minute for any others who might show up. And I am going to write something into the chat.
Welcome, folks. So glad you're here.
I'll start in just a moment. Well, welcome everybody. I think we'll begin. I'm Renae Hanson, but we'll do more introduction as we go on. I want to start with a meditation to help us all get here. I'm reading from, this is my book, Watershed. It's not really mine, it's its own thing. It's like when you have a child, you send them off and they're not yours anymore. They're their own thing. Book is like that too. I think the book is probably best read as an accompaniment to your own meditations. So we're going to start with one from about the middle of the book, it's short, called The Voice of the Body. I'll read it and you can see how it resonates in you. What, just now, is the nearest body trying to say? Yes, that one, the one that is you. Do you hear it? Will you be still and listen? Our bodies are our closest piece of land. Closest probably to our awareness, at least. So it seems important to hear them. Let's take a moment and just listen. And if your body needs something, water, whatever, we'll get that. Or you might want to record what your body needs. Write it down. Sometimes listening to our bodies is the hardest thing. Part of what I wrote about in the book was my own rapid onset adult at the age of 64, type 1 diabetes. And I almost missed it. I almost died, actually, because I wasn't attuned. I knew something was happening, but I misjudged what it was and did not get the medical help I needed at the time. I have to say, you're all off screen. So if I don't make eye contact, it's because I will just start reading names. If anybody wants to come on with your face, then I'll see you and I might be more, hello, there's some faces. Yes, it's easier actually when you can see some people's eyes, right? And you can see if they nod, and now there's a number of you, so it's great. I'll do better. So I hope you brought your bodies. Bringing our bodies is the first step. Sometimes we bring our minds, but not our bodies. Our bodies get left behind. So welcome, bodies, and whatever else. And I want to welcome the bodies of all the other beings, the trees outside your windows, the birds that might be at your feet or flying by your lands and fields, and those who aren't here. I'm going to read two little parts from the beginning of the book. I wrote, "For Minnow Lake's watershed, and all who have drunk, and all who will drink of its waters. I grew up on a tiny little watershed, and we understood it up in the woods far north in Minnesota, right outside of the Boundary Waters. We called it the pond, but on maps it's called Minnow Lake. And that is the watershed that I'm most responsible to protect because it fed me much of my life. I'm not there all the time now. I'm living often with my kids in Seattle, but I go back to Minnow Lake Watershed. And I'll read this too. The woods and waters that nourished my youth are territories of the Ojibwa. The college where I teach, now taught, lies on Dakota land. I offer respect and thanks to the original people of these lands who are still here. I ask for the blessing of the ancestors on my intentions, on my words, and on us as we talk. I want to invite you to put the name of your closest watershed or of the indigenous people you know and interact with in some way into the chat so we can just see and acknowledge by writing the names of our watersheds or of the people who cared for the land long before we were born. We acknowledge them. And then we think of ways to give back, both to our watersheds, which I'm amazed how all of you are doing this as I hear of you in this conference. Yes, okay. So there's Maurice River. Yeah, New Jersey, Lenape. Rice Creek watershed. Yeah, Lake Champlain. Yes, we have our big watersheds and our little ones. You know, the tiny one. I used to ask my students to go outside their house and pour a cup of water right outside their front door and then follow it. They might have to pour more to follow it, but where does it go? Often my students were city people. It goes into the storm drain, but then where does it go? You have to look on a map to find it. I gave you links to something I wrote about my St. Paul watershed, and you have to look into the storm sewer pipes and how they get to the Mississippi. But it was really instructive for people to find that their watersheds had names and went somewhere. I remember a student who was a student studying in the Twin Cities who said, "Oh my gosh, what I do to the water here will affect my family farm in Iowa. Never thought of that." Well, yeah, it does. So thinking about those interconnections, I think, is one of the most important things we do as people. I am hoping to have more of a conversation instead of just a talk. I know it says book talk, but whatever. My talking, what I had to say at the time I wrote in the book. So if you want to hear from me, you can read the book. But I'm going to read bits, and then I invite you to unmute and tell me what you have to say. I was really lucky to grow up in the woods, and we were mostly self-sufficient. My dad taught in the high school, so we did have monetary income, but he didn't teach summers, and other than that, we lived pretty much off the land. Some my uncle's farm. Yes, and I have asked Sarah to record the chat so we can get the names of all of these watersheds later. We moved to the lake, this little bit of land right outside the Boundary Waters. When I was 9, we started, and then moved there when I was 10. And I'm going to read you little bits of what that was like. Before the house, we built a Lincoln cabin. We laid spruce logs on 3 sides, cut a canvas tarp over the south-facing open side, and positioned a wood-burning stove to the west. There we ate and played games and told stories during the many months of house building. My new sister lay on a blanket on the ground. My first-grade brother and I sat on tree stumps next to each other as he did his best to read, even though he saw letters and words backwards to the way they appeared to me. Sandflies chewed off patches of our skin. Our necks and hairlines would begin to itch on the second day. Mom spread calamine over them. We picked mint to boil in water for tea. We hauled rocks, burned brush, applied bug dope, changed the baby, leveled ground. My brothers helped Dad build rock walls. I prepared food with my mom. I watched as Dad drilled down a sand point to get water for drinking. What he pulled up was the sweetest water any of us had ever tasted. In fact, any of us still have ever tasted. And it tests perfectly. We're really lucky. It was cleaned by the pond across our road, then wiped pure by the sand and rocks and tiny creatures down where the water table fed it to us. One thing I try to get across in the book is how we're made up of tiny creatures. All those tiny creatures clean the water, and also my beta cells cleaned up. Well, they allowed me to continue living for 64 years. And they're tiny little creatures, as are our mitochondria. So we're all made up of communities, and we depend on the communities and the land around us. I think you all know this, so I think I'm preaching to the choir. Many of my students hadn't thought of it. But if you know anybody who hasn't thought of it, you can talk to them about it. And then we get these wonderful gifts. I was so lucky. I read about how I was baptized. My family didn't believe in baptism, but I wanted to be because I thought my friends would accept me better. I lived in a northern Minnesota town after all, and I was really lucked out. I was baptized in the Mississippi River, and actually it was the river that claimed me. It was the place where the water began. I talk a lot in those book about the amazing gift in Minnesota of we don't have any rivers that flow into Minnesota. They all of our water comes from the sky, either rain or snow, and then it flows in 3 directions and waters much of the continent. It's a huge responsibility too. Any Minnesotans on here? Because we get water pretty pure, not entirely anymore, but it used to be, and we send it on kind of not so pure. But many of us are working on sending it on to all of the rest of you. Great Lakes people, we send it to you. We send it north to Canada and Hudson Bay from 2 watersheds, and we send it south. Sarah Moore had a short stint in the Twin Cities, so she knows the Mississippi. Yeah, we started there. Another little bit I'm going to read. What I had found was that I belonged in the water and in the woods. We spent long days kneeling under red pines, picking blueberries. I settled into the emptiness of bliss with moss under my knees, pine smell filling my head, bulging blue rolling into my hands. Many of you spent long days picking blueberries. It is heaven. Well, if you're under pine trees. It's a little different when you're in those fields with nothing above your head and the sun's beating down and they're planted in rows, if you can find a pine forest. Mom and I walked through the woods with juice cans strung on twine hanging around our necks. We filled the cans with service berries. We call them June berries, though. Pin cherries and plums. We scrounged the roadsides for strawberries early in the season and for rose hips as the summer turned. When we noticed standing deadwood or recently downed trees, we dragged them back to the lot. Dad and the boys would split them while Mom and I made puddings and pies. We'd cool off after the work by jumping into the lake. From the garden, we picked beans and corn and peas. My mother ground wheat. My dad convinced my uncle to grow an acre of wheat without spraying it for us. My parents were early food faddists. If any of you been called a food faddist? We were food faddists, and we were not very popular in the 60s and 70s, 60s. My parents started that in the late 50s, and it was not the thing to do. But my uncle grew us 1 acre of wheat. Dad helped harvest it, brought it home. We cleaned it. Mom ground the wheat and made bread. Later I did. I blended cream to make butter and formed it into roses or squirrels before setting it proudly on the table. Great thing for a kid to do. Do you want to say any of the gifts you've gotten? These are the gifts that I've gotten, and this was part of, many of you probably have a book that you need to write. I thought early on that I wanted to write, but I was a girl and people told me that I'd never make a living, and I was poor. And And then I started teaching at Minneapolis College, where my students were amazingly wonderful and diverse. And it was clear that their stories were more important, I thought, than another white woman's stories. So I spent my career mostly really pushing my students to get their words out. And they have. They've done great things. But gradually they came back to me saying, you have privilege of access to people that we don't, and it's going to take us too long to tell them our stories of like climate change in Somalia, for example, or heat islands in North Minneapolis. So would you please take our stories to your audiences? That began to change my mind about my own writing. And then my love for my land was another thing, and my despair about climate and what it would do to my area of the Boundary Waters, and also the agony of the stories of my students, who were, many of them were climate refugees. And I need to give back something to this land that so wonderfully nurtured me, and do what I can to bridge the divide between my rural outstate family, who are not automatically environmentalists, and my hometown miners, who are almost by definition not, or are seen to be not, environmentalists, and also my city environmentalist friends, who are often kind of one track opinionated negatively toward my family and hometown folks. So I've been trying to step into a sort of divide, and it feels to be working to a small degree, not changing the world like, I wish, but I think we each have to step into the divides that are ours to cross. And I have people in both worlds and some voice in multiple worlds. So I try to bring those messages. Do you want to say anything? The next thing I'll read, if as we have time, is what the Somali elders taught me. But anybody have any words right now? Just unmute and say them. No, you come to a book talk and you just think the person's going to do all the talking. Well, I wasn't a teacher for nothing. I'll see if I can get you to say anything. Here we go. This is from my Somali, some of our students. Many of you know Minneapolis College as MCTC, if you are from the Twin Cities at all. So you know it's right by Loring Park, and it's a really wonderfully, diversely diverse campus. In the early 2000s, 3 colleagues and I offered listening sessions on campus for students who might be troubled by impending climate distress. About a dozen students gathered with us for each of the circles. 2 older students in neat black suits and closely cut hair sat together during the first. They listened as younger people spoke of fears for the future. Then one of these elders said in quiet English, "The Somali crisis did not start with a war. First came the drought." "Yes," the other man said, "and the drought was because the climate had changed. The clouds did not come. The rain stopped. The herds of the cattle tribes had no grass. The fodder available to the camel people became less. There was nothing for the goats. The goat people moved onto the camel people's land. The cattle herders brought their animals too. There was not enough for the camels. How could they share with these others?" "What would you do?" asked the first man, looking one by one at the non-Somalis in the room. "Let your children starve?" We sat together in silence. "So there was battle," they explained. I had read in the news that the Somali crisis was a matter of tribal war. These elders added context that altered the story. A few students stayed on for the next listening circle. Among the new people who joined us was a third Somali elder. He sat quietly until halfway through when one of the students asked him, the war in Somalia, did it start because of a drought? The man furrowed his brow and nodded. It did, he said. Many people and animals died. What did you do then? As the animals died, some of us men went to the city, to Mogadishu. We thought we would get work, but there was no work. So we went back to the countryside and we cut down the trees. We knew if we cut down the trees, we would further dry out the land. If there are no trees, the rain does not come. And when some water falls, it can't soak in. But we cut them down and we made charcoal and we took it to the city to sell. We made the drought worse and we fought among ourselves. You were trying to keep your family alive, one of my colleagues added sympathetically. I was, he said. I was a leader there. Now I'm your student. I learned much more from my students than they ever learned from me. Some of them say differently, but that's because they don't know how much they know when they enter. This is a hard history, and I heard it from students from Mexico, from Texas, from Florida, from Mongolia, from Vietnam, from all over. So, and 2000 was a while ago, but we are making progress. Anybody want to say anything now? How do you hear that story, or how does it overlay with your own? You can also hold comments in your heart, and I'll keep reading to you. I love reading to people, so it doesn't bother me. But if there are things that you need to say, because I'm not managing to read enough in the chat. If there's things that you need to say to this gathered group, be sure to say them, because we have a responsibility to what rises up in us. I dealt in the book a lot. I was dealing with a lot of sadness. And if you have things you need to write, you may. And as we go into the future, it is heartbreaking and scary. We need to develop the methods, the practices to help us deal with heartbreak and scariness. With one of my former Oromo Ethiopian students who lives in the Twin Cities now but has family back in Ethiopia. She knows, of course, when one of her cousins decides to get in one of those leaky boats that you read about in the news and cross the Mediterranean. And then we don't hear for several years. Or worse, maybe that cousin didn't make it to the boat and is now part of the sex trade in Libya or something. We would go to the Mississippi and speak her cousin's name together. Because the people, her family and friends, could not bear the sorrow. They'd want to hear about it one day, and then they'd want to forget because they had somebody else they knew about the next day, and they were trying to raise some money to send food so that the next person wouldn't get on one of those boats. So going to the river is a good thing. In this time, I was also celebrating or grieving the loss of my beta cells. You all know your beta cells? You know what they are? They're in your pancreas. They make insulin. because in your cells, in every cell in your body, you have mitochondria that came from your mother that have different DNA than your DNA, which is fascinating, for one thing. And that mitochondria creates all the energy that your body uses. And it's a different creature than you are, but it's in a symbiotic relationship with you. And you pass it on if you have daughters directly. They have the same mitochondria as you do. Anyway, the cells need sugar. The mitochondria turn sugar into energy. So sugar, glucose, needs to come into the cells. But the cells cannot open to let the glucose in without a key, and that key is insulin. Insulin unlocks the cells and lets the glucose in. Your pancreas, and specifically the beta cells, Isles of Langerhans are also called, in your pancreas makes it makes the insulin that unlocks your cells. If your insulin doesn't match really well with your cell structure, the key doesn't work really right. And that developed in a lot of people whose ancestors lived in famine. If they lived through famine, then the ones who used glucose really efficiently and who stored it well were the ones who survived. But now we all have plenty of sugar food, plenty of glucose coming in. So the people whose ancestors lived through famine are likely to develop type 2 diabetes because their bodies are still programmed to store it instead of use it up. And their bodies are always begging for more because of the history of their family. It's really genetic. It is not their fault. And that's one of the big things I want to preach is like, stop blaming people for their diabetes or for their overweight. They're not, it's genetic. And anyway, I'll get off that. Then there are others like me who have a kind of, mine is genetic, but they don't know if most of it is that your beta cells die off. It's autoimmune. And we used to call it juvenile diabetes, but hit me at 64. And gradually, you don't have any insulin. And then your cells can't open and the mitochondria can't eat and they die. And your cells die and you lose weight and your eyes shrink, and I could see better because my eyes shrunk, but that meant they were dying. It took me a while to figure that out. Anyway, I didn't even know about my beta cells until they were gone. I'm going to read you another little part about Native American ethics, which I have learned a great deal from, both through the woods that kind of taught me the same things and through my wonderful Native friends and neighbors and teachers, Winona LaDuke being the first who told me kind of a distillation of a Native American ethic. Native American ethics tell us that we are all one family. We are family with our winged brothers, the mosquitoes and eagles and doves. We are cousins to the standing folk, the mountains and the trees and the stones. We are sisters to the people with fins, the pike and sharks and carp. We are relatives of the flowing folk, North Wind and Mississippi and Gulf Stream. We are all indigenous to this earth, though many of us not to the places where we now live. Our ancestors, somewhere in the past, knew themselves to be one with the land on which they rested. Many of us have forgotten what once was known. We can relearn from those who are indigenous to the lands where we happen to live now. Although many of us have lost our indigenous roots, each of us can become newly attuned to the place where we reside. My beta cells are gone, so I sing for them. Beloved beta cells, now that you are gone, I know to have adored you. Grateful now, I sing your praise. You magnificent cells that gave me 64 years. You weighed my food without a scale, without eyes of your own. You separated carbohydrate from fat, took the measure, timed the moment of entry of sugar into my blood, produced insulin so that the mitochondria might eat, Dear departed beta cells, how I love you now that you are gone. Actually, getting diabetes, thank you, helped me deal with climate distress because my body is now no longer able to function on its own. I have an insulin pump. I've never seen one. Let me show you my pump. It's like this, and it's connected to me on here. It reads out what my sugar is right now, which is okay. I can get through the session. And I got a plastic tube connecting it to me. I'm a plastic activist, but I will use it. I decided that I would get insulin and I would get a pump and I would keep getting insulin. I have students whose parents don't have access. And I had lived long enough, maybe, but I decided to stay around. My friends and my family wanted me to. But I think that we each have to make a decision when something like this happens. At the same time that I became type 1 diabetic, my sister-in-law got ALS. As she lived for 2 years, and she decided at some point against the next intervention. And more of us have to make those decisions one way or another. Partly because I have a gift life. I wrote this book. It took despair and years of work and poverty and agony and the death of a lot of dogs for insulin to be developed and made available to those of us who are dependent on it to be able to eat it all. And that gave me hope for a climate. My pond, my lake, my water system is no longer independent. It can no longer completely clean itself because of dead microbes and stuff that's in the rain. But we're working hard. My brother's got a really big project working on it. A lot of you are. We are really working to try to keep these systems alive and return them to health. So that's a big goal. And I am more comfortable now with the fact that we need to work with some technology too. I have to now figure out my carbs. My beta cells used to do it without even asking me. Sometimes I'd eat meals that were all carb, and sometimes I'd eat meals that were no carb, and I didn't even know because I didn't know what carbs were. Now I know, and now I have to do the math. And now I have to program my pump. We've got a lot of work ahead of us because we've got a world that's also lost many of its beta cells of one sort or another. But we're smarter than we used to be because we are working with all of these others. The bacteria, we're working with the little microbes in the earth, we're working with all the mycelium. We are listening to the trees, we're watching the birds. We have returned to something that I think our ancestors lost. We got off the path, many of us, at least many of us settler descendants. Our ancestors got off a life path, and we are working on getting back on it. Do you want to say anything now, or do you want me to read something else? I'm a Quaker, so I'm comfortable with silence, y'all. I mean, it's not because I'm a Quaker, it's because I grew up in the woods. If you are a companion of trees, or birds, or rivers, you know silence, and you know that it's one of the best places to get grounded, to find yourself, to know what words you should speak. So I guess you're all going to have to write your stories because you're not saying them. I'm going to read you about Najwa, my good friend Najwa Bukhari. In 2014, on the bus from Minnesota to the People's Climate March in New York City, I met Najwa Bukhari. She, with her husband and young son, could easily have flown. Instead, they rode that bumpy, crowded bus, as the others did, by choice. After the march, she agreed to speak with my students. She had been a physician in Saudi Arabia, her home country, where she had led an effort to save the mangrove forests there. At a time when it was not legal in Saudi for more than 3 people to gather in public, she managed to get permission for women, most of them of a more leisured class, and men, mostly fishermen, to come together for public mangrove cleaning events. Roberto, a student in the first class Najwa visited, spoke up right away. By the way, I changed most students' names unless they asked me to keep them the same, so some are their real names. Najwa's is her name. Anyway, Roberto said, "My family in Mexico fishes among the mangroves," he said. "Without the mangroves, we would not have fish. But our groves are in danger like yours. People want to cut them down so they can build houses right by the shore." Najwa told the class that Saudi Arabia once had stretches of forest, that it once had been green. But now rains no longer come. "Once the trees are cut," she said, "the clouds do not return." "So it has been in Somalia," several in the class agreed. "With no trees to exhale moisture into the air, few clouds develop above them." "You have trees and rain yet in Minnesota," said Najwa. "Protect them. They are your life." "Are you Saudi?" an Oromo student asked. "Do you know that your people are buying our land?" "My people are not wishing to sell, but the land is being taken from us, then sold to the Saudis. Once your people buy it, they grow crops and take it all back to Saudi Arabia. We have no land left to farm. What can you do about this?" "Is that true?" asked Najwa. "I'm sorry if that's so. I'll look into this. Please, what is your name?" So she did the research and wrote back to the student. "Yes," she wrote, "what you said is quite true, and I am sorry. I apologize for my country." Then she told him what she was doing to advocate back home against the practice of land theft. The next semester, when Najwa visited my class, she said she was learning permaculture design because she wanted to nourish the land for generations to come. And there was discussion about what term to use, permaculture, restorative ag, and now I'd switched to restorative ag, but at this time we were using permaculture, which is more a term that should be used by Native people, as I understand it. And I'm always learning new things, so anybody can correct me. A couple months later, my friend Julie mentioned that her restorative agriculture initiative in southern Minnesota would be able to expand into a farm-scale model because a major investor had come forward. A determined couple, she said, was offering to buy 60 acres to add to the 40 the project already had. As she described the passion of her investors for testing out large soil-restoring fields, I thought of Najwa and her husband, Tom. Could they be the investors? "Yeah," Julie said. "You know Najwa? She has incredible power." So this strange thing happened, Well, maybe not strange. We come together. Fortuitously, I guess. Over the months, Julie reported back how Najwa inspired and pushed and accompanied her, walking the fields, cajoling the South American and Mexican American immigrant farmers, appeasing people of the nearby college town. This became Sharing Our Roots Farm in Northfield. Listening respectfully to affronted neighboring farmers, meeting with lawyers and bankers. Some of you know all this. She persistently explained to the bankers that no, she was not interested in protecting the interest on the money for her children. What she was interested in was protecting the land forever for all children of Earth. The bankers had never drawn up such a contract before, but Najwa and Julie persisted. What they arrived at was a covenant for the land. In April, the purchase agreement was signed. In May, Najwa led a ceremony of blessing for the land and saw the first seeds planted. Then she and her family flew back to Saudi Arabia. Julie called me on a bright day in June to say that Najwa had died at her mother's home in Saudi Arabia. Before she left Minnesota, Najwa had watched the planting of the first hazelnut bushes. She had helped spread the first wildflower seeds across the land. Remember Najwa's words about clouds. If the trees are gone, the clouds won't come. With Najwa, protect and plant bushes and trees. When next I saw Tom, Najwa's husband, he showed me an email from Saudi Arabia. People there had just given a memorial for his wife. For Najwa, they had planted 50 trees. I miss Najwa. She died way too young, but she left the farm and she planted the trees, and we were able to go up on the hill, a group of us, her friends, and do her ceremony again in the Arabic, but translated also into English. I'm going to end with the coda at the back. These are the life principles of the Ojibwa people indigenous to northern Minnesota watersheds. Winona LeDuc first gave these to me and other students in the 1990s at Minneapolis College. And with her permission, I wrote them. They were originally not to be written. The principles are supposed to be, ethics are supposed to be in living things, like in living brains and tongues and ears, and not put on dead trees that have been mashed up and turned into paper with dead ink, because they need to change. They need to change as the conditions change. Your memory will change them. But permission has been given to write them down, but I only want to write them down with that caveat that you change them as the conditions change. Because what was said in Moses's time, for example, is not necessarily what the conditions on earth are now. These are the principles. The way things are in nature is the way things ought to be. Ought to be good water systems and beta cells. Life moves in cycles and ought to move in cycles. We start as babies and then we get old and then we ought to die. Not to think we should live forever. The cycles, like spring, should come after winter, not in the middle of it, right? And night should probably be dark. Nearly everything is alive. I've wanted to know what isn't, probably some antimatter, and maybe greed isn't alive. But we are all one family with all that is alive. All that lives has standing. That means that should have a voice in any decision, even to the furthest generations. We should take what we need and leave the rest. You don't take all the blueberries. You take what you need this year, and you leave the rest for the birds and the bear who needs to come and eat some, and for the next year. And when we take, we must give. I'm going to say this quickly. When you eat, you must shit. Got that? And those are okay words to use. And if you eat well, your shit will be nice and clean and it will nourish the ground. It's a good process, but it's also good when we take berries to leave tobacco or sage or whatever we got. Give. As we take, we give. The good life leads to continual rebirth. If you haven't read it, read the story of Jumping Mouse. When I die, I hope to become, I suppose, worm, and then maybe bird, and then who knows, maybe a wolf. That would be delightful, wouldn't it? Or a fox. We get to be part of the circle. If you want the book, you can, I put in the chat a code for 30% off right now that the University of Minnesota Press kindly made available to all of us. You can also go to my webpage. I'll put that in there. There's a blog with some writing. Actually, one of the latest things I wrote has taken me in a bigger writing project direction, and also writing and videos and things from some of my students. And there's a contact form. So feel free to contact me during the rest of the conference or through one of those ways. Thank you all. Shall we at least unmute and say goodbye? Let me hear your voices.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank
Renae.
you all.
Thanks so much.
Well,
So
thank you
wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you so much. That was great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Loved it.